kind of report these results in the next meeting of some kind of Academy of Science in Paris. But he could not do this experiment because there was no sunlight. So just before the meeting, just few days before the meeting, he said anyway he will develop the photographic plate, and people still, philosophically discussed that what prompted him to develop the photographic plate when he knew that there was no experiment done, sunlight was not there, so he could not expose the salt to the sunlight, he could not do the experiment. But even then, he simply developed the photographic plate, and this is some of the picture of that. So he found that uranium salt actually did emit the radiation, even when there was no energy given to it. So that was termed as a spontaneous radiation. So that is how this word spontaneous came into being, that it is on its own. It is without any input to the salt. It emitted spontaneous radiation. And then he actually reported this result to the next meeting. A couple of days later, there was a meeting of the scientists. So he did report that, this is what happened. Without any input of energy, energy was released. So people were completely confused because this appeared to be violating the rule of law of conservation of energy. That energy cannot be created on its own. You have to have some kind of energy conversion from one energy to another energy. That is okay, but how do you generate energy without any input? So people were completely perplexed, but this experiment was then taken up by many contemporary scientists. And then the story goes that it completely changed the way physics, chemistry, and geology was done. I will come to that. And if somebody is wondering how does it help geology, so whatever geology we know, right from formation of the earth, we know it is 4,550 million years back. We also know that sometime later the moon formed. So that is also very accurately dated, 4,527 million years back. There was a Mars-like object which hit the earth and then moon formed. We also know when actually the first life appeared. And then we also know when the Cambrian life started, when the vertebrate animals started, when the humans started. So all these times are very well known, all because of this accidental discovery. So once this Becquerel reported this, then many people started working with this mysterious radiation. And then the Rutherford and the, Madame Curie and her husband Pierre Curie and all these people started discovering many such radioactive compounds. So it was then finally established that uranium compound which Becquerel was working with had something which was radioactive or which was emitting the radiation. And that something was still not known. So there was, at the same time, there were other kind of experiments were being done. And one such experiment, is very famous. It is by Thomson. And what he was doing is he was trying to understand the discharges of electricity which takes place in some kind of vacuum tube. So he was putting some cathode anode in a tube, and he was trying to see what kind of rays or discharges takes place. So he used to put some kind of electric field around this tube and try to see which are the, if there are some any deflection because of electric field and all. So that was supposed to be the first kind of mass analyzer, because that used to separate discharges according to their mass by charge ratio. So he was the first one who showed that there are certain charged particles coming out of the atoms or the gases which are there in the tube. So that is first discovery of charged particles. Then electron, proton, and all those things were being discovered. But then, he also observed that for a particular element, there are two different types of trajectories observed when they were put into the electric field. So it was actually for the element neon. So this is the initial days of those experiments in 1912. He found that for a single element, there were two different types of trajectories observed. So he hypothesized that a single element could have two different masses, atoms of two different masses. And that is where the isotopes were discovered. And later on, the same experiment was followed by Aston. And he not only discovered two isotopes of neon, he actually discovered some more isotopes. And then that is how this mass spectrometry, field of mass spectrometry started. People started looking at, they have understood that a single element can have atoms of different types, particularly atoms of different masses. So to find out that how many elements have what type of different mass isotopes, this technology of separating atoms of different masses in a single element started developing, and this is what today has led to this technological advancement of mass spectrometer. And this is the initial technologist, I can say, Near, who has developed the modern style of mass spectrometers, where you can easily separate out all types of atoms. Now, I will not go into details of this technology and experiments and how they separated isotopes and all. I will come back to the radioactivity in terms of dating the natural materials, natural rocks and natural minerals. How do we date them based on the radioactivity? And that was, now we take it for granted, it is very common application, it is very commonly known, everybody talks about it. But again, it is very interesting to look at from initial development of this particular application. And even before radioactivity was discovered, from a geologist's point of view, it was always a very enigmatic or very fascinating question that not only how old these rocks are, but how old the entire planet Earth is. So this was a very big, outstanding question, particularly for geologists. This was a very big question, and this is a quote from one such geologist. His name was Arthur Holmes, and till recently, till our days of studying geology, the textbook by Arthur Holmes used to be a very fundamental textbook in stratigraphy and physical geology. This Arthur Holmes has, was saying that it is perhaps a little indelicate to ask our Mother Earth her age, but science acknowledged no shame, and from time to time has boldly attempted to wrest from her a secret which is proverbially well guarded. So it was so well guarded that nobody was able to find out how old the Earth is. And there are many interesting ways people were trying to find out that how old the Earth could be. And if you look at this, some people were trying to interpret the religious text. Many religious texts talk about the origin of the world and the universe and the earth. So people were trying to interpret those religious texts to find out when this earth would have formed. There were some physicists who were taking more scientific approach, and this is a very interesting story. That I will come to that cooling of the earth can provide the time estimate for the formation of the earth. I will provide a little bit more on this, how it can be done. And then some people were even trying to use the ocean chemistry to find out the age of the earth. And the idea was very simple. They know that very simply, very layman's terms, if I put this idea, it is like that that oceans are salty because rivers are bringing salt to in the ocean from the weathering of the land material, and slowly with evaporation this concentration is going up. So if you can estimate today or rate of salt coming to the ocean and rate of evaporation, then with these two rates you can find out how much would be the rate of accumulation. Then if you find out the total concentration of salt today and you know what is the rate of accumulation, then you can find out what time it would require to come to this salinity. So this is one just a simple example, but similarly people were trying to estimate the rates of different accumulation and residence times of different elements and trying to find out how long it would take for developing that kind of concentration in the ocean water. So that is one such attempt. And then of course another attempt could be to measure the thickness of or stratigraphic thickness of sedimentary rocks, and then estimate that with what rate sedimentary rocks can be deposited, what rates they are being eroded, and then you do simple calculation. Okay, this is the rate by which sediments are brought, and this is the rate sediments are lost. Now with these two rates, what is the net accumulation rate? So once you have net accumulation rate and you can estimate the stratigraphic thickness of sedimentary rocks at a particular place, then you know overall how much time it would take to develop that kind of thickness of sedimentary rocks. So this was another approach by which people were trying to estimate the total time it would take to deposit that much of sedimentary rock. So that could be the time since when this kind of process may be going on. And it was assumed that this kind of process must be going on since the birth of the earth. So that could also be related to the age of the earth. So there were very interesting and rigorous, I would say, for that time analysis people were doing for finding out how old the planet of the earth. In fact, just before our generation, this used to be a very big topic in the syllabus of geology student, that how to estimate the age of the earth and what could be the possible ages of the earth which are reported. But out of all this analysis, the most popular was the thermodynamic approach for calculating the age of the earth. And the reason was that the person who actually did that was a very big scientist of his time. His time was in the 19th century to the early 20th century. And we all know him very well because in his honor, the temperature scale is established. So Kelvin scale of temperature, everybody is aware of. That Kelvin scale of temperature is because on his name, he was also given lordship. So he was known as Lord Kelvin. And he was very popular and very respected physicist, and he was expert in thermodynamics. So president of the Royal Society, which was the most respected society of scientists in England. So his idea was that he knew that how heat is lost. So he knew that heat generally is lost by conduction, and there was some kind of estimate, or he assumed that the earth might have started as hot as today's surface of the sun, let us say. And then starting from that hot earth, how much time it would take for earth to cool, particularly on the surface temperatures, today's average surface temperature if you take. So he simply tried to calculate that by conduction, if the heat is being lost through earth, then how long it would take for earth to cool down from as high as temperature as the sun's temperature to the surface temperature of today. So you can see this was one of his, papers, initial research papers or reports. I have taken this slide from some other presentation. It is available, somewhere. I don't remember now, but you can see he has written this heat loss equation, dV by dx, differential equation, by putting different boundary conditions. And by doing this kind of rigorous analysis, he has estimated the age of the earth is around 100 million years. And it was such a beautifully mathematically done rigorous analysis that people could not kind of oppose this or could not find any fault with it. In fact, this kind of mathematics, when we teach to our geology student, I am reminded of a cartoon which I saw. I found it very funny. After explaining such kind of rigorous mathematics, when teacher asks any question, only question a student like me would ask is that how do I transfer to some other department where mathematics is not there? So this is the kind of respect we have for rigorous analysis of mathematics. So when Lord Kelvin has shown by this kind of rigorous analysis based on well-founded principles of heat loss. By the time this was a well-established law of thermodynamics, the heat loss through conduction and convection and radiation, all these things were very well known. So based on that, if you provide some estimate, people have to accept it. Even though those geologists who were working in field, who were trying to understand the field observation, they knew that it cannot be right. And in fact, there were many, at that time, some papers were written challenging this estimate based on the field observation, because it was very simple to see in the field that the thickness of sedimentary rocks which are exposed, and there were field methods to calculate the stratigraphic thickness. That means you correlate different sedimentary strata and then find out the cumulative thickness of a sedimentary formation. So those were so thick and the rate of accumulation is so low that geologists estimated that it would take much longer than 100 million years to deposit such kind of huge stratigraphic thickness. In fact, there are certain field places where in one place itself you can see a huge strata of sedimentary rocks. For example, very popular, very famous such kind of place is Grand Canyon in USA, where you can see 1 mile deep canyon, which is basement is Precambrian hard rocks, so I mean the crystalline rocks, but above that for 1 mile you have only sedimentary rocks. So such kind of huge accumulation of sedimentary rocks cannot be possible in 100 million years given the rate of today's sediment accumulation. So when this kind of challenges were coming from the field geologists, Lord Kelvin actually set again to his calculation, changed certain parameters, certain empirical values, and he revised his estimate to 400 million. He said that there is no way that Earth can be older than 400 million years. So that was the status when this. But it was the Rutherford who could immediately understand the implications of radioactivity in terms of heat generation. So he suggested that radioactive decay, which takes place on its own, it is also a source of energy. This emission is a result of some release of energy, and he immediately understood that this was the problem in the Lord Kelvin's calculation, because Lord Kelvin's calculation, there was nothing wrong except that he did not know that Earth is not only cooling, but there is some heat is also being generated. And there's another story that he was a very young scientist, Ernest Rutherford at that time, and he wanted to represent a research paper on this in some conference where Lord Kelvin also was there in the audience. And this is a quote from Ernest Rutherford's some autobiographical text, where he says that he was presenting, or he was planning to present, that the calculation made for the calculation of age of the Earth by Lord Kelvin is wrong, because the heat is not just being lost from the Earth, but heat is also being generated because of the presence of radioactive element inside the Earth. And but he was afraid, because he was young research scholars like you. I mean, young student, I think not very old than what you are right now. So he was not very sure that how Kelvin would take it, because he's pointing out some mistake in his idea. So then this quote, I don't know whether it is true or not, but it is attributed to Ernest Rutherford himself. He says that when I was about to present that part in my presentation, I saw Kelvin sit up, open an eye, and cock a baleful glance at me. Then a sudden inspiration came to me, and I said, Lord Kelvin had limited the age of the Earth, provided no new source of heat was discovered. That prophetic utterance refers to what we are considering tonight, radium. So he was reporting the release of energy when radium undergoes decay. So, he was trying to say that very cleverly. He actually said that it was predicted by Lord Kelvin that if there is no heat source, then Earth would be so young, and Earth is not so young. That means he predicted in a way that there should be some heat source, and this is how radioactivity is discovered. So this is, but even then it was not till 1956 This is a very historical paper. I don't know whether you can read this, which I am circling this particular date. It is 1956, where there is a scientist called Clary Patterson, and Patterson has published a paper giving the age of the Earth. And this is this is called isochron. This is called lead isochron. So he has published this paper giving the age of the Earth as 4.5 billion years. And this was the first such absolute age estimation of the entire Earth. But of course, this was not based on any measurements on the Earth samples. It was based on measurements of lead isotope ratios on meteorites. And the idea was that meteorites are also objects in solar system, must have formed together with the other objects in solar system, including the Earth. So his idea is that whenever the Earth formed, at that time all objects in solar system must have formed, including the meteorites. So meteorite samples were available. Meteorite samples are being collected since many years. So he used some meteorites, and he has found that lead isotope ratios actually plot along an isochron. We will discuss this technique, this particular technique later in the class, how this isochron can be formed, what is an isochron. And interestingly, Patterson, who was basically a physicist and a mass spectrometrist, he also analyzed some of the recent sediments like a shale from nearby areas, and that also fell onto the same isochron. So he said this is a confirmation that Earth also formed together with the meteorites. Even though now we know that it was just a coincidence. Some people, some of my friends call it a geochemical accident, that the sediments also plotted on the same isochron, but actually they need not to. It is simply a coincidence that they plotted on the isochron. But nevertheless, this has confirmed that the age or the Earth is as old as 4.55 billion years. So after that, after this experiment in 1956, many geochemists, many physicists, chemists, technologists, all have repeated the same type of measurements by taking different types of meteorites, different types of samples, and they have now revised it to 4.567, but more or less this 4.55 billion years age is still, that is a kind of, everybody could reproduce this number by taking different samples. So this is what is now believed. That Earth is, or this is now, it has been confirmed that Earth is as old as this. So this is not just to kind of enthuse you, or at least personally, it excites me, quite a lot that such kind of unintentional discovery of radioactivity could lead to such big understanding of the planet Earth and many geological processes. But this is all based on the simple concept that there are certain atoms, certain isotopes which are radioactive. So this is the simple basic concept. Now, because it is based on this concept, I thought we will also investigate it in little more detail. And the investigation would be by a simple question. And the simple question is, why should it be like this? Okay, why should be there any radioactivity at all? Or in other words, what I'm trying to understand is, why should some atoms or some isotopes decay? Okay, there is another word which we use in this discussion is the nuclide, because we know decay is a nuclear process. So many times this is the word nuclide which is used. So let me just familiarize you with some of these definitions. So isotopes, isotopes are the atoms of the same element having different masses. So that is the definition of isotopes. And nuclide is the word generally we use for a particular nuclear species. That means different isotopes are different nuclear species. So another word which is interchangeably used for isotope is a nuclide. And another thing which is very important in this discussion is the atomic masses, where AMU, atomic mass unit, is generally used. We will come back to this a little later, but it is defined as carbon atoms, one isotope, which is very abundant, the 12 mass number isotope. Please assume that corresponds to 12 units of mass, or 12 atomic mass units. So all other atomic masses are represented with reference to that 12 carbon isotopes mass. So these are the general words which would be coming across very frequently when you read any text related to isotopes, radiogenic isotopes, or geochronology. So the question now I'm asking again in terms of using the word nuclide, that why should certain nuclide be radioactive, or why should certain nuclide be decaying? Okay. I don't know if you have any ideas. At this point, let me just give a pause to my lecturing. And let me ask you if you have any idea that why should there be a radioactivity, or in other words, why should some nuclide be decaying or radioactive or emitting radiation spontaneously? So before I ask you the answer, let me also tell you very precisely that what exactly radioactivity is defined. And I have already mentioned the word spontaneous emission. So this is the key word in the definition, and the key word and definition is radioactivity, the spontaneous emission of radiation by unstable nuclide. Okay, so now the question is why? Why should it happen? Any ideas on this? If you have any prior reading on this, because it is generally taught in school nowadays. So if you can recall something, or in your geochemistry course, if you had any discussion on this, I would like to hear from you.
In order to attain a stable electronic configuration.
Okay, anyone else? No one else has any thought on this? Why there should be radioactivity? Why should there be a spontaneous emission by some nuclide? I'm surprised. I thought, yeah.
So the number of neutrons are far more than proton, which lead to instability, and then they emit radiations.
Okay. We will discuss all these answers, but I'm not satisfied with only couple of people speaking their mind, because this is something which is not supposed to be new to you, right? It is something which you must have thought about at some point in the study so far.
It happens to attain stability of nuclide.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, as Suyesh said, number of neutrons and number of protons. If in an atom, number of protons and number of neutrons are same, then it won't decay. But as the atomic number increases, the number of neutrons it will increase. I mean, proton will also increase. So the ratio will change, and it will lead into instability, and it will decay.
All right. Anyone would like to add or delete to these answers? Now I have 3 people speaking, so it is 3 out of 31 today. 3 out of 30 would be 10%. No, that is okay.
Yes, since Suyash said, as there are a higher number of neutrons, they are in a high energy state. So in order to attain a lower energy state, they emit radiation.
Okay. All right. So you have some kind of ideas, but there is some clarity which is missing. and some misconceptions I can see. So that is the idea of this discussion now, where we will try to understand it a little bit more clearly. And the first thing, let me comment on your answers where the misconceptions, let me point that out. First thing is that the right part of your answer is yes, any decay, not only this, whatever conversion or reaction or decay we talk about, that is always to achieve a stability. So things as such must not be stable. That is why they are having some process, right? So in this general, this can be called a true thing. So radioactive decay also, one can say it is happening to achieve the stability. So unstable nuclides are undergoing decay to achieve the stability. That is right. That is the right part of the answer. But I think Dixit used the word electronic configuration, which is the wrong part of this, because this process is a nuclear process, right? Electronic configuration is an atomic thing, right? So there is a distinction here. When we talk about electronic configuration, that is always with reference to chemical reactions. Chemistry is based on electronic configuration in an atom for an element. But radioactive decay is a nuclear phenomenon. It is a nuclear process. So that has nothing to do with electronic configuration, except that number of electrons are decided by the number of protons in the nucleus. So whatever is the number of protons, a neutral atom will have only that many electrons in its electronic configuration. Other than that, the nuclear phenomenon or nuclear process has nothing to do with the electronic configuration. That means the stability should be achieved in terms of nucleus. So here when we are talking about instability, we are talking about an unstable nucleus. Now, Suyash and Anjita and Malavika, their thinking is a bit logical, but not correct. It has to do something with the neutron to proton ratio. You are right. But whether number of more neutrons are making it unstable, that is what you are saying, which is not correct. In fact, more number of neutrons are making it stable. No, it is just the other way than what you said, that more the number of neutrons, it would be more unstable. In fact, I will just show you a chart of nuclides, which I wanted to show you at a later stage, but it is okay. I'll just see that slide is there somewhere here. Okay. So this is the chart of nuclides. Okay. What is the chart of nuclides? It is by a kind of a graph where horizontal axis is the neutron number and the vertical axis is the proton number. Neutron number means number of neutrons in a nucleus. Proton number is number of protons in a nucleus. And then in this, you can see these black color dots here in the middle region. You have black color dots, right? Can you see this black color?
Yes, sir.
So this is all this black color are those isotopes which are stable, which are not radioactive, which are not unstable. These are all stable. And all other colors, the red, this yellow, this blue, these are all those isotopes which are unstable. And this bluish magenta color line is the line where number of neutrons and number of protons are equal. So for very small number of nuclides, this number of new protons remains same for stability. I mean, for stable nuclide, this is same. But as the number of protons or as the number of neutron increases, the stable nuclides, the black dots, are not along this line. Stable nuclides, the number of neutrons are becoming larger than the number of protons. You see, equal number of neutron proton line is this, but you see the stable nuclides are all displaced towards the right of this equal line, right? That means this is the neutron number axis. So for a given number of protons, you have more number of neutrons for the stable isotopes, isn't it? So it is not correct to say that if neutron number increases, these nuclides become unstable. That is not correct to say. Now the question remains, then why is it so? No, the whatever initial question is still not completely clearly answered. But one thing we have understood in this discussion, in this thinking, is that in order to answer this question, we should understand how actually these protons and neutrons are configured or are arranged in a nucleus, or the answer should lie to understand the stability and instability of a nucleus. So basically, we are talking about the nuclear structure. What makes it unstable, what makes it stable. So in order to understand this, let us first look at certain observations or certain properties that we know about the nucleus. So one thing we know is that it has protons, which is generally shown as Z here, and it has neutrons. So the total number of nucleons. So this is called nucleon. Nucleon means all those particles which are there in a nucleus. So protons and neutrons are called nucleons. So the total number is called the mass number of that atom. Okay, so we know that in a nucleus you have a certain number of neutrons and certain number of protons. Okay, we also know that the size of the nucleus is extremely small, right? And it is proportional to how many nucleons are there, right? So it is proportional to A, and if you consider it a kind of sphere, let us say for assumption or for simplicity, if you assume it to be a sphere, then you know the volume of the sphere is 4 by 3 pi r cube, right? 4 by 3 pi r cube. So if r is the radius, then it is 4 by 3 pi r cube is the volume, right? If r is the radius. But this should be proportional to the number of nucleons. So it should be proportional to the A. The size of the nucleus should be proportional to the cube root of A. And R0 is a proportionality constant. And proportionality constant is an approximate constant. That means value is 1.2 into 10 raised to minus 15 meter. Now you can see how small is actually the nucleus, isn't it? 10 raised to minus 15 means we know about micrometer, which is 10 raised to minus 6, nanometer, which is 10 raised to minus 9, right? So it is something like 10 million times smaller than a nanometer. Nano itself, nanometer, nanoparticles too are considered to be very, very extremely small particles. It is 10 million times smaller than that. So this is a unit called femtometer. 10 raised to minus 15 is called a femtometer. And nuclear physicist, very famous nuclear physicist was there, whose name was Fermi. So in his honor, this unit is also called Fermi. You can read it here, the Fermi. So this size, why I am emphasizing the size of the nucleus, one can see even relative to an atom, it is very small. In fact, if you see the atom, if you remember your crystallography, we used to talk about the interatomic distance, which is the bond length between the two atoms, right? And we talked about the closest packing of the atoms, where all the atoms are touching each other. So the bond length is equal to the 2 radius of the atoms, right? And if you remember what is the unit of those bonds or those atomic radii, for example, we saw the anion radii of oxygen, right? If you remember those units, it was, and even the cation anion radii is also around 1.2 angstrom, right? 1 angstrom. So angstrom, is 10 raised to minus 10 meter, isn't it? So you can see it is kind of 1 lakh times smaller than that. So nucleus is even 1 lakh times smaller than an atom. Isn't it interesting? Why should it be interesting? Because even though it is very small compared to atom, but all the mass of the atom is within the nucleus. So huge mass compared to the size. So it is actually very, very dense object. In fact, I would like you to do this exercise as an homework to calculate the density of a nucleus. You can see you can find out the absolute masses in terms of kilogram for proton and neutron, and take any atom's nucleus. For example, you can take carbon atom's nucleus, where there are 6 protons and 6 neutrons, right? And you put the R0 here. The R would be 8, that is 12, so cube root of 12. So you can calculate the radius of the carbon nucleus by putting 1.2 into 10 raised to minus 15 here. A is equal to 12 here. So you will get what is the radius of carbon atom. And then assuming it to be spherical and knowing the masses of protons and neutrons, so you can find out kilogram per meter cube density for the carbon atom. I'm asking you to do this this calculation. That would make you realize that the kind of density we have of nucleus, probably you cannot think of any known object of such high density. No, it would be several 100,000 times more than any dense object, whatever, for as a human being, we know this, solid iron is very dense. Somebody as a geologist can say, no, sir, core of the earth is very dense, right? Core of the, earth could be more than 10 kilogram per meter cube, right? Or, that kind of density. That is nothing compared to the density of a nucleus. It is several 100,000 times more. So it is so dense. It is interesting to think in this way, because that makes us realize that even though all the nuclei of all the atoms are so dense, but no material formed by the same element is as dense as their nuclei are. Isn't it interesting that carbon nuclei, if you see, is so dense, but you take a graphite or diamond is very dense, made up of all entirely carbon, but still the density is nothing compared to the density of the nucleus of the carbon. Similarly, you take any nucleus of anything, you would find that the nucleus is so heavy, dense, but the material made up of the atom of the same element is very light or very less dense. So what does it indicate? Indicate that there is a lot of empty space, which makes it so between the electrons and on the nucleus. If nucleus is something like 10⁵ meters smaller than the atom, that means that much space is kind of empty space in an atom, in an element, isn't it? So somewhere I was reading that this analogy, just to make this, make us appreciate, that textbook author was writing that if you want to visualize the empty space or relationship between size of nucleus and an atom, you can visualize in terms of a a football field. So the entire football field, if you assume to be an atom, then the football kept in the center would be a nucleus, something like that. So it's such kind of empty space is there around the nucleus, but nucleus as such is a very dense object. Now you must be wondering that why did I devote such a long time discussing the density of the nucleus? Just to make you understand that to keep neutrons and protons together in such a smaller space so densely would require a huge amount of energetic forces or binding forces to keep them bound in a nucleus. So nucleus stability, if you want to understand the nucleus stability, you have to explain or you have to understand that how this nucleons, which include proton and neutron, are kept together in such a small place, so densely packed. So people have proposed several hypotheses for that. Before we come to those hypotheses, let me show you one more observation related to this, and that is the binding energy. as I was telling you, that to keep these nucleons together in such a small space, so densely packed, you need to have some kind of energy binding them together, and that is called the binding energy. And this is a famous curve which is given as binding energy per nucleon. So here, let me write it here. If you call it EB as binding energy, this is binding energy per nucleon, EB by A. A is the number of nucleons. So this curve is between binding energy per nucleon versus the number of nucleons or mass numbers. And all the elements are plotted here. So you can see this curve rises slowly, except for helium where it is very high, and then otherwise, other than helium, it is slowly rising, and it is kind of peaks at mass number 56. So this is the mass number 56. It peaks and then it slightly, gradually it decreases. And that the peak isotope, which is 56 mass number iron elements isotope, that is the most stable nucleus. So when binding energy is high, then it is more stable. When binding energy is low, then it is less stable. So in other words, you can also define binding energy as the energy required to give or required to input in a nucleus if you want to break it. So if you want to unstabilize it, or if you want to break it, then you have to give the energy equivalent to the binding energy to the nucleus. So that is the another way of understanding the binding energy. This curve also tells us that when binding energy per nucleon is less, nucleus is less stable. That means it can try to achieve the high stability by increasing its binding energy. So how it can do so there are, if you simply look at this curve and look at the heavier mass number isotopes, they are lower than this peak curve. So that means there is a possibility that they will try to go in this direction where binding energy is higher, because that will make them more stable. So to do that, there is something called a process called fission. So if a heavy nuclei, mass number heavy nuclei, if it breaks into two smaller size, so that means mass number will reduce. So they will go in this direction, and if mass number is reduced, their binding energy per nucleon may go up. So that is more stable. So fission is one process by which stability can be achieved. And when this lower binding energy is converted to higher binding energy, the energy is released. Now, sometimes it appears a little confusing, because how can energy be released when you are going from lower energy to higher energy? If you go from high to low, then energy is released, that is understood. But that becomes clear if you think binding energy in terms of some kind of negative energy. So you are increasing more negative energy. That means you are releasing more positive energy. Negative energy, why I'm saying, because it is increasing the stability or lowering the total energy of the system. So by fission process, you are taking this to high band energy per nucleon side. That means you are releasing the energy. Same thing you can say for the lighter nuclei, that they may try to go to the higher binding energy per nucleate side, and that can be done by fusion. If suppose you fuse two lighter nuclei together, then their mass number will increase, so they will go towards the right side, and when they go towards the right side, they are climbing up the curve of binding energy per nucleide. So in that process also energy can be released. So these are the two ways by which binding energy per nucleon can be increased. But lighter nuclei can be fused, or the heavier nuclei can be broken into two parts. So this is the process. The fission process sometimes take place on its own, spontaneous, for very heavy mass numbers, nuclei. And the fusion is supposed to be the energy source for many stars, like our sun. It is fusing the hydrogen atoms together to make helium, and that is called hydrogen burning, and then more nuclei to the helium to form the heavier mass nuclei. Probably you must have discussed that process in terms of nucleosynthesis, how nucleides are actually formed by such kind of fusion processes, or such kind of, that is also called burning processes. That is the energy source, because in this process, binding energy per nucleon is going up. And if you consider it to be a kind of negative energy, so if you are increasing the negative energy, that means you are releasing some positive energy. So that is energy source in many of this kind of nuclei. If still some people finding it confusion that how binding energy per nuclei increase would release the energy, you can also go back to the original way I have explained, that binding energy is the energy required to break a nucleus. So once you are going up, and that means you will require more and more energy to break. That means it is more stable, right? More energy to break means you would have some energy which was already there is released. So now you have to give more energy to break. If you have less energy to give me, that means already some energy was there. So external energy needs to be given to break a nucleus would be less. But if you release that extra energy, then you have to give more energy to break. So that process would release the energy when binding energy per nuclei is going up. Here, in school, you must have understood that this energy is coming from where? So that is coming from the conversion of mass. And this is where the famous Einstein's equation E is equal to mc square is applied. Okay, so the binding energy is also sometimes called as the missing mass, because suppose you talk about this fusion. So if you talk about the total mass of all the nucleons which are there in these two fusing nucleides, and then whatever resulting nucleide you have formed, you calculate the mass of the nucleons of the resulting nucleide, they don't add up. If you take a fissile fission process and you take up the heavier mass isotopes total mass, and then you make two smaller nuclei and add up their mass, they don't add up together, right? So some mass is missing. That mass is actually converted to energy in terms of binding energy. So this is some calculations generally, people in beginning courses of nuclear physics or radioactivity or this kind of courses would generally do, to calculate the binding energy by adding up the mass and then calculating then using this equation mc square and calculating the binding energy. We would see if we would like to do such equation, maybe some leisure time, I will give you to calculate some binding energy per nucleon of certain isotopes, and that time this concept probably would be more clear. So these are all the observation about the nucleus, that nucleus has some binding energy, and it depends on the mass number. And another observation is that as the mass number goes up, the neutron to proton ratio goes up, right, as we have seen in the chart of nuclei. So based on this observation, people have hypothesized several ways to explain the structure of nucleus. By the way, before we proceed further, I would like to ask you whether you have any class now, or shall we do it in the next class? Is it becoming too long? So let us.
We can continue, sir. Yes, sir.
Let me just quickly tell you maybe another 15-20 minutes we can take, and let me quickly tell you what are the different hypotheses or models which people have proposed for explaining the structure of nucleus. And one such model is called liquid drop model. And what this model envisages is that the nucleus is a kind of a drop of liquid. For example, if you have spilled some water on some surfaces, if you have seen those, the way water spreads, if the water is not continuously flowing, then you would see there are some droplets which are more or less spherical in shape, and they will remain together. The drop will be having its own morphology or its own entity. So it is, even though it is not solid, but there are molecules of water which are sticking together. They are having enough cohesive forces to keep them together in a drop. So that kind of analogy people have taken, that neutrons and protons are mobile within the nucleus, but they are still somehow sticking together. And to explain that sticking together or remaining together, they have used the analogy of molecules within a liquid drop. And we know that those molecules are held by some kind of volume energy. And this volume energy is basically molecule to molecule interaction. So these people who have proposed this model for nuclear structure, they say that all these nucleons, whether it is protons or neutrons, they are having one-to-one interaction with them. And that one-to-one interaction is keeping them together. That means there is some kind of bonds between these nucleons. And because they are very tightly packed, so what is visualized is that there could be, some kind of 12, because we know in the closest packing the coordination number is 12, right? So I'm just trying to draw, that these are nucleons, and each nucleon may be interacting with the 12 neighboring nucleon. There is some kind of bond is there between 12 neighboring nucleons, and each bond is shared by 2. So if you have this bond energy which is keeping them together is U, so this volume energy is sometimes written in very simple word that it is something like 6U and proportional to the mass number. So how many total nucleons is there? Or 6U is some kind of constant, so you can write A1 here. And so this is some kind of volume energy which is keeping it together. But we also know that on the surface of such configuration, the coordination number for each nucleon will not be 12, because surface, on those nucleons which are sitting on the surface of the nucleus, they will not be surrounded from all sides by the nucleon. So this surface energy would try to disrupt such, because surface energy or the nucleons which are there on the surface, their energy state is high because they have not interacted with all possible nucleons, like those molecules which are there on the surface of a liquid drop. We call them surface tension, right? So those surface energy in a liquid drop is called surface tension, and that is, if you write it as, that should be proportional to the surface area, right? So it is like, if you kind of assume it to be a sphere, then the surface area would be 5 pi r square. But r is proportional to a root a1 by 3, right? So it is also proportional to square by 2 by 3. So it is proportional to the 2 by 3 power of mass number a. So if you put a constant here, so surface energy is also negative energy from this perspective. If it is volume energy positive, then surface energy is negative. So this is another energy which is in play in nucleus. Another important thing we know is the Coulomb energy, because protons are charged particles, and if you bring two same charged particles together, they experience some kind of repulsive force, isn't it? So that also one should consider, that if you are putting them too tightly together, then they should experience some repulsive force. So that is called Coulomb energy. This is also should be negative. And that should be proportional to how many such protons can come together. So if there is proton number is Z, then total pairs of such could be Z minus 2. So this kind of pair of protons could come together, possible combinations of two protons together out of Z. So this is this you can put as a kind of constant. So you can put Coulomb energy is proportional or equal to some constant A3, but this is also negative energy plus, and this is this is actually related to mass number. So some form of mass number dependence of Coulomb energy also comes here. Then there is also asymmetry energy, because if all the, yes.
So, can you please tell why we call this Coulomb energy is negative?
We are calling this positive negative in perspective of holding the nucleus together. So all those energy which contribute to keep all this nucleus together, we are calling them positive. And all those energies which want to disrupt this nucleus or this nucleus, we are calling them negative. So volume energy is the energy related to interaction between constituents of that volume. So constituent of volume of nucleus are nucleons, that means proton and neutron. So some type of interaction should be there, or some kind of bond between these nucleons should be there, which will keep them bonded, right? Bond is what keeps them bonded. So that is a positive energy. The bond energy is positive energy, and it is spread throughout the volume. So we call it volume energy, and it is proportional to the volume, which is proportional to the mass number. So higher the mass number, more such bonds would be there. So more such bonds would be there means higher would be the energy which would keep them bonded. So if you call them positive, if you call it positive, then all those energy which are trying to break these bonds or trying to disrupt this structure will be negative, isn't it? So in that perspective, Coulomb forces between same charge particles like proton should be negative. So from that perspective, I am calling them positive negative. Is it clear?
Yes, sir. It's clear.
Okay. So similarly, there are other two types of energies which people have discussed in terms of explaining the nuclear structure, analogous to a liquid drop, that is called liquid drop model. One is called asymmetry energy. So these are proper equations have been derived for each of these. I am just trying to give you gist of how these equations would have been derived for these three energies. But asymmetry energy refers to the deviation from equal neutron to equal proton. So if it is not symmetrical, then that energy also should be considered. And similarly, how these things are paired, whether there is all the pairs can be made or some nucleons remain unpaired, so that would also be considered. So these energies, nuclear physicists have derived very precise equation, and their idea is that can we reproduce this binding energy curve. So if you draw them separately, for example, if I draw the volume energy is simply proportional to the mass number, or it is a kind of constant, so it will be very high, it is positive. But surface energy and Coulomb energy can be going negative like this. But if you put them all this together, they could reproduce this binding energy curve, right? That was the idea, that all these energies which we have discussed here, volume energy, surface energy, Coulomb energy, asymmetry energy, pairing energy, which are there, which are contributing to the overall energy state of a nucleus. If you combine them together for different mass number nuclei, if they are producing or reproducing the binding energy per nucleon curve, which is an actually observed curve, that means more or less your explanation is right, because you could reproduce your observation, isn't it? So that is why this liquid drop model was popular initially, because by adjusting some constant values, A1 values or A2 values, or here some constant A3, A4 will come. So by adjusting certain values of this constant, people could reproduce the binding energy per nucleon curve when they have plotted all these energies together versus the mass number. So whatever energy we have written, EV, ES, EC, EA, EP, all this energy, if you write together, so EV plus ES plus EC plus EP plus EA, okay, all this energy, if you add together and plot them versus A, and if you are reproducing this curve, which is versus A and energy per nucleon, that means whatever energy you have calculated are right, because that is what is observing, that is what is matching with the observation. So that is why this liquid drop model was quite popular. But then there were some other observations which were not completely explained by liquid drop model. So what are those observations? And that observation is generally, called as the magic number nucleids. What was this observation is that if you look at the cosmic abundance curve, I hope you would have seen in your geochemistry the cosmic abundance curve, that how different elements are, distributed, or what is their concentration with respect to, or in the solar system or in cosmos. So there they have found that all those nuclei which have this kind of neutron or proton numbers, 2, 8, 20, 28, 50, 82, 126, they are more abundant than the other nucleides or than their expected abundance. So these kind of isotopes are more abundant or more stable. So this used to be called as magic number isotopes or magic numbers for stability. So if a particular isotope has 2 neutrons or 2 protons or 8 neutrons or 8 protons or 20 neutrons or 20 protons, then that would be more stable or more abundant than others. So this was not completely explained by the liquid drop model. So another model which was proposed to explain this is called shell model. And shell model is thought analogous to the atoms, the model of atomic structure. Now, in atomic structure, we know that electrons are arranged in different energy shells, in different quantum of energy, right? So we have KLMNO orbits, then within that we have SPDF orbitals, right? So there are different shells in which different energy levels in which electrons are configured. So in a periodic table, the last column is the most stable or most unreactive atoms, right? So chemically, the inert gases are most unreactive or most stable in that way because their shells are completely filled. So people have thought that probably within the nucleus, the nucleons are also arranged in different energy levels. And whenever these energy levels are completely filled, that means all kinds of energies are completely satisfied, that is the minimum energy state, or that is the most stable state. So those energy levels should be corresponding to this many numbers of nucleons. So there is a big quantum mechanical discussion on this shell model, and those people who are good in nuclear physics, they can find out some relevant books where people have actually derived the proper equations of all those nuclear shells, and they have explained that this 2, 8, 20, 28, 50, 82 are actually those numbers for which nuclear shells are completely filled. So this is the shell model, and then somebody has actually taken some properties of the liquid drop model and some properties of the shell model, and then they combine them together to call it collective models. So this is more or less explains all those things which we know about a nucleus, right? So now if we come back to this question that why certain nucleides are not stable, now it is easier to answer it with more clarity, right? Now we know that what holds them together, like we know the volume energy should be more than the disruptive energies like surface energies and like your pairing energies and like your Coulomb forces. So now, for example, even if you look at from the perspective of Coulomb forces, once you understand that the Coulombic repulsion would disrupt, but volume or bond energy would hold them together, then you have to, if you want to make it stable, then what you have to do, you have to increase the bond energy without increasing the repulsive forces, right? So how you can do it? By increasing those nucleons more which do not contribute to the Coulomb forces, and those nucleons are neutron. So what it means is that if you increase more neutrons compared to protons, you are contributing to the volume energy, which is stabilizing energy, which helps in stabilizing of nucleus, and minimizing the Coulomb energy, which is disruptive energy, right? Now you probably can understand that why should this stable nuclide should have more neutrons than protons, right? This chart I was showing you, that as the number of mass number increases, the stable nucleides deviate in a way that they have more neutrons than the protons. So now it is clear that all these nucleons, whether it is neutron, proton, they interact with each other. So that helps in volume energy. But when proton-proton interact with each other, they may be repulsing each other. So there are two types of interaction now you can see may be happening in the nucleus. One is that irrespective of its charge, no, every nucleon will have some kind of bond with each other that will minimize the energy. So if you make these bonds between nucleon, that is a kind of, you can say, attractive force or holding or binding force, right? So that will happen between a pair of protons also, between neutron and protons also, between a pair of proton neutron also. So that is some kind of binding force. But at the same time, if there are two protons together, then they will also have repulsive force in addition to the binding force, which may be depending upon what is the distance between these two, because these forces are dependent, you know, Coulombic force is dependent on the distance, right? So at certain distance, Coulombic force will be more. So at certain distances, the internucleonic forces would be strong. And if you further press it, then again some kind of repulsive forces may act into. So this is scale dependent, but it would be there. So if you are increasing more neutron, then you are increasing the binding force, internucleonic force, because between neutron also that kind of bond will be there, or that kind of interaction will be there, which will keep them together bound. But the repulsive force will not be there. So you are minimizing the Coulombic forces. So that is why you have more neutrons coming in the nucleus to make it more stable when the mass number goes up. Once we know this, then in general one can say that a nuclide would be unstable and consequently radioactive depending on what is the neutron to proton ratio. So that answer would take care of pairing. That answer would take care of the liquid drop model related understanding like Coulombic force, volume energy. And so this is some kind of collective model answer we are giving. So finally it comes out to be that what is the number and how within the number of the nucleons, what is the ratio of neutron to proton. So for certain nucleides, there should be an ideal neutron to proton ratio to keep it stable. If that ideal ratio is disturbed, an ideal ratio in respect to all these causes of instability that we have discussed. It should be paired properly. It should be having enough volume energy, less Coulombic energy, less pairing energy, less asymmetric energy. So all these things, if you want to put them together, you can say the neutron to proton ratio should be, that is what will determine whether a nuclide would be unstable or stable. Okay, so I think the question which we have asked in the beginning, which led to all this discussion, has a very simple answer at the end. At the end, the answer is that it is the neutron to proton ratio which determines the stability. And if neutron to, so there is a certain neutron to proton ratio required for a stability of a certain type of isotope. If it is more, then also it will be unstable. If it is less, then also it will be unstable. Okay. Now here one more thing, let me just keep a mention that when I'm talking about the neutron to neutron interaction or bond, internucleonic bond or proton to proton attractive or binding force other than the repulsive force, and I'm talking about it happens only at a certain distance. So there is one curiosity or one problem in the particle physics was that what is the nature of that force, how actually that force takes place. So that to explain that, there is something called meson theory, which is proposed to explain this internucleonic forces, which are basically binding forces or which contribute to the volume energy, or which I am referring sometimes as bond between two nucleons. So this is now being explained in terms of some kind of particle exchange So now people believe that neutron and protons are not the fundamental particles, or they are not the smallest entity in the nucleus. There could be even smaller particles. So I will not go to all those quarks and those things, but there is something called mesons, which are sometimes known as pi mesons, or in short form, they are also called pions. So this theory proposes that between any two nucleons, whether it is neutron-neutron or neutron-proton or proton-proton, there is some kind of exchange of these pions. So pion will go from one nucleon to the another, and in that process, some kind of bond will establish. And depending upon what is the distance, that could be attractive, that could also be repulsive. So if there is a very interesting, very good textbook for all this. So all this material, if you want to read on your own, I would suggest undergraduate level textbook, which is by the author Beiser. And this book's title is Modern Physics. Modern Physics. There is one chapter, there are many chapters in this book, but the chapter which I have used for this discussion I think the chapter title is Nuclear Structure and Radioactivity. I think this is the last, some of the last chapters of this book. There, to explain this kind of pion exchange between nuclei, he has used an analogy of two players exchanging the basketball. So if you are catching the basketball, suppose there are two players playing the basketball. So if you are catching the basketball, you will move forward. But if you are throwing the basketball, you can move away. So that way, he has explained that the same pions, when they exchange, they can create attractive forces, and they can also create repulsive forces, but that depends upon what is the distance between them. Okay, so overall, what we wanted to understand was the stability field of or stability region of these nucleides, which are shown in this chart of nucleides. And as I told just now, I will repeat that finally the answer is that it is the neutron to proton ratio which determines the stability of a nuclide. If neutron to proton ratio is more than the stability field, which is here, then also a nuclide would be unstable. If neutron to proton ratio is less, then also the nuclide would be unstable. So let us keep today's discussion to this point, and the next class we would ask another equation. Okay, another question. But what happens to an unstable nuclide? And then we know the answer is radioactivity. So is the radioactivity is similar for all the unstable nuclide, or is there any differences for the different types of unstable nuclides? So this is the question we will answer in the next class. Okay, so let us close this discussion here. As I told you, in the next class, we will discuss what happens to these unstable nuclides. How do they achieve stability? That is what we will discuss. And then finally, we will say that how this process of achieving stability is useful for us as geologists. So that will take us to our actual, more interesting discussion probably.